Hello, everyone, and welcome to Light Channel TV in Denmark. We have the privilege to have live with us online from New Zealand, Ross Patterson, which we will welcome in a few minutes. Before we do that, I'd like to give a short introduction to the program that we are recording live today. And as you have seen in the title, it's about the French Revolution. French Revolution, which took place from 1789 to 1799. And as many of you, maybe you're a historian, maybe you have studied this subject, maybe you have learned from other people, maybe from other programs, was a period of political and social and religious upheaval in the not just the political but also the social religious history and France, and also partially of Europe as a whole. We know from the history that the French governmental structure that was back in the 1700s and actually prior to that was previously an absolute monarchy dictatorship with feudal privileges for the aristocracy and especially for the Catholic clergy, and then underwent a radical change. As we know from history, it culminated with the Napoleonic Wars, the restoration of the monarchy, and two additional revolutions as modern France took place. In today's program, we're not going to cover the French Revolution as history as such. This has been covered partially by the previous presentation that we have aired last Saturday, by Ross Patterson. If you haven't seen the first part, you're welcome to go in and watch the first part, where Ross has done a very good introduction to the subject that we're going to continue to cover. And this program is going to be in several parts. There are so many information. Maybe this is something new for you. Maybe you're wondering, why would we compare the French Revolution with what is happening today? Is there any political, social, or maybe spiritual application to the time that we live today? And actually, there are a lot. And you might be surprised that we're going to show a lot of similarities to what is happening today, to the end time events, to what happened during the French Revolution. Well, let's get on with actually our compass, because this is not something some religious people made up, or we just made up this conversation, this program. This is actually something that other people, other Christians have discovered based on the Bible. So there are actually similarities between the beast and what we are calling today the beast in Revelation 13 and 17, and what we are calling today the French Revolution. And I'm going to put here on the screen a table that you can see. I'm not going to read all the verses, but I just want to put this as an introduction. It's a very important background information. We are setting the ground for this important program. This is something which we can relate to today. This is happening right before our eyes, and we as Christians and as people, we have to learn from history and see, is there any application for the time that we live today. So these two chapters in the Bible, Revelation gives a comparison. So chapter 13 gives an explanation. We have here several characteristics of the beast, as we also have in Revelation chapter 17. So the specification which we find in Revelation 13 has been studied for hundreds of years during the time of Reformation by all Protestant Christians, and there has been, and there is still, maybe not in general, an agreement that these specifications are fulfilled only by the Roman head of the beast. So does the specification that we find in chapter 17 as well. So let's move on with our conversation. And I want to welcome you, Ross, live from New Zealand. Welcome and good evening to you.
Thank you, Michael. It's always good to be here, and thank you for the invitation to join in this very interesting discussion.
Yes, indeed. And you have done a great job in actually introducing this program to our viewers, for those of you that have seen Ross' presentation about Revelation and the connection to the French Revolution and some of the time events. And today we have set up this program. We're going to cover 12 what we call similarities between the French Revolution and the times and the last day events that we find today. So every single of these step we're going to take through the next programs, we're going to discuss in as much detail as possible, based and doing the groundwork and actually anchoring our presentation, of course, in the Bible. Ross, I'd like to ask you from the very beginning to just give our viewers a short overview of your last presentation about this topic.
Yes, the French Revolution is one of those things which was, well, it changed the whole political landscape in Europe. To give a bit of background, as you know, for hundreds of years, Europe was dominated by the state church, the Roman Catholic Church. Just about all the countries of Europe were, shall we say, Catholic controlled. You had governments that were very sympathetic, governments that worked together with the papacy. And this was the status quo for a long time. Now, reformers had popped up now and then. You had Huss, you had Tyndale, etc. People that had popped up over time to say the church needs to be reformed. Finally, I guess, around about the time of Martin Luther, things had reached a critical mass, if you want to call it that. There was sufficient discontent with the way things were, that when Martin Luther nailed his theses to the door, the 95 Theses, to protest the sale of indulgences, it began a groundswell. And this started the Protestant Reformation. And Germany was changing. The message was getting out to get back to the scriptures, to follow the Bible, not tradition. The Netherlands took hold of this, and the UK, the Protestant Reformation took root there. And it was beginning to take root in France. But then it was, shall we say, snuffed out. It was squashed at the beginning. You probably heard of the St. Bartholomew Day massacre, when they estimate 50,000 Protestants in France were slaughtered. And so the papacy retained control of the French government. The monarchy basically had the church and state together. That's symbolized, of course, by the woman in Revelation 17 riding the beast. So that was very much retained that way in France. And so the Reformation never took hold. And so the status quo continued. You had the monarchy and the church working together for a couple hundred years, suppressing very vigorously and violently anyone that would oppose them, until finally, about 200 years later, in the 1700s, people had had enough. They'd been ground down, they were poor. There was an elite class that was living up very well. The Palace of Versailles was built in the 1600s, and if you visit that today, you'll see the luxury that was being built there. The money of the people being ground down was being used to support this aristocracy. And it reached a critical point, and people had enough, and hence you had the French Revolution. And because Catholicism was seen as Christianity, the people threw everything out. They disavowed belief in any God. it became an atheistic revolution. And all religion was thrown out. You had lots of strange things went on. They took this dancing girl from the opera and they put her on a carriage. They carried along and said, "This is the God of reason that we now worship." They tried to bring in 10-day weeks. All sorts of strange things went on. And this led to a lot of instability. And of course, ultimately, when people wanted stability again, people like Napoleon got into power. And the offspring of the French Revolution is still with us today. For example, the communist world today is very much where you have the state religion as atheism. And the impacts of the French Revolution are very widespread. Perhaps people today don't appreciate how much impact today we have from the French Revolution. Our education system is very much evolutionary based. It's quite a big impact. And the reason this is important, Michael, as you know, is because this is a type, this is a foreshadowing of what is going to embrace the whole world at the end. That is why it's worth studying this. The same forces, the same teachings are at play here. The same disparity between the rich and the poor is developing today. And that's why understanding what happened in the French Revolution is so significant and important for us to appreciate and understand what is happening today in our world and where it's going to lead to.
Exactly. So thank you for the comments. And this is what we're going to cover in this presentation. And I'd like to to kind of provoke our viewers, if you want to follow and check that everything we're saying is according to the Bible, then please take your Bible, find your Bible. We're going to cover some very important issues and topics from Revelation 11, chapter 13, and 17. And as I'm bringing up on the screen here, we're going to present some of the contrast between the beast of Revelation 11 and the beast of chapter 13 and 17. Now, the beast of Revelation chapter 11, we have some very prophetic information. So I have some of the main lines from Revelation 11. And again, you can check with your Bible and see if this is correct. Rise is about 1798. That's the beast from Revelation 11. Not to be confused with the beast from Revelation 13 and 17. It's only one of 10 kingdoms. Makes war on the papacy. It's like Egypt, which is atheistic. The king of the south, that's another topic. Anti-religious. Under this beast, the 2 witnesses are slain. Of course, this requires some biblical background, understanding of these symbols. So what are the 2 witnesses, by the way, Ross? Just a short explanation to our viewers.
Yes, these are the 2 witnesses which are described there. And if you follow through in chapter 12, these are the 2 witnesses which feed the woman when she flees to the wilderness. And to summarize real briefly, this represents the Old and New Testament. This is the scriptures. Basically, it's the Word of God. And the issue, of course, was during the reign of the papacy, they suppressed the scriptures. And in the French Revolution, they literally burned the scriptures. So both of these have made war, if you like, on the Word of God.
So both the papacy that was prior to the French Revolution and the French Revolution as well. Now, Ross, I just want to make a short break here in our study. I want to just have a short conversation about the history about the French Revolution, which is being actually presented in the history books today worldwide, not just, mainly in the Western part of the world, because the history that we have been taught and we read about the French Revolution, it's about freedom, it's about equality, and it's about democracy. This is about French Revolution, right? So when we come up with this presentation about the French Revolution and say, hey, wait a minute, this is actually not what really happened. This is actually a twisted view about the history, about the French Revolution. And how in the world are we actually going to connect it to Bible, to prophecy, and even to the beast of Revelation 13 and 17? That's probably quite provocative for a lot of people, because we have been taught to see the French Revolution as something good, as something that brought us democracy, that brought us freedom. But is that also the real history, Ross?
Well, that's a very good point. You know, there's a saying that often the first victim in war is the truth. And you find a lot of oppressive regimes, communist regimes, for example, that came up after World War II. They say, we want freedom, and they would rally the people to say, we're freedom fighters, they'd call themselves. And many countries were taken over by communist regimes under the banner of liberty and freedom, you know, freedom for the people, tired of the oppressive, if you like, colonial regimes. And what ended up happening, many places like this, Vietnam, Cambodia, etc., is the regime that came in ended up being worse and more oppressive than the one they replaced. And as you say, a lot of what we hear about the French Revolution, it was a cry for liberty and freedom, and yes, it was. But as often happens, that is hijacked by people that are worse tyrants than the ones that they're trying to replace. And I think the French Revolution was no different. The tyranny that went on, you know, it was said, if you oppose the revolution, we're going to slaughter you. And so many people were slaughtered during the revolution under the guise of, we need to have liberty and freedom. And they'll use that as a guise to chop people's heads off. It's the double tongue, you know, of the serpent, really.
Yeah. And if you read the real history, it's actually called in a real history book, The Time of Terror, I believe it's called, the period of the French Revolution. Well, I said this is not going to cover the French Revolution, the history as such. I just want to mention that we are very much aware of the, let's say, official narrative about the French Revolution, but we do have also real history books that are still showing us what really happened during the French Revolution. And even so, more important, why we find it so important as Bible-believing Christian is because Bible actually prophesied the French Revolution. This is amazing. This is actually the main point that we're making today. And as such, we're going to make the comparison. That's also the goal of these programs, of these recordings, to the time that we live today. And why we're doing that? Well, if you look around, if you haven't been living under a rock, you've seen what's happening in the world today since March 2020. The world is actually getting closer and closer to a boiling point. And a lot of countries, and especially France, it's actually getting closer and closer to a point where we might see again a new revolution because of the freedoms being taken away, and especially for what is happening in France, as for a few weeks ago, that almost everybody has to show a so-called vaccine passport to get access to even go shopping. So it's not something which we're just pointing into the future. This is not a historical approach only to the French Revolution. This is actually a present approach and not a futuristic approach to the French Revolution, because we want to see, is this something that we can feel, we can sense to the world that we live in today. So let's get back to the Bible, because I wanted to make this point with you, Ross, that the beast of Revelation 11, as we see on the screen, is different than the beast which is being described in Revelation 13 and 17. And this is pretty clear. The beast of Revelation 13 and 17 was slain and wounded in 1798 by the French Revolution. We know, everyone knows from history, General Berthier, Napoleon's general that took the Pope as a prisoner, and which ended the papacy timeline in the prophecy. The territory included the 10 kingdoms, and the beast in Revelation 11 was one of the 10 kingdoms. The beast of Revelation 13 and 17 makes war on the saints, is controlled by Babylonian religion, that's the Scarlet Woman, and under this beast the two witnesses prophesy in sackcloth, and that's something we know from history. So, Ross, would you like to add, do you have any comments on this comparison?
Yeah, it's interesting that obviously as time was going on, the beast that Satan was using, the power he was using, the papacy, was beginning to lose its influence and control. You had the Reformation taking off and establishing itself in parts of Europe. And Satan is a master, so he brought up another beast, if you like, this French Revolution, as a new form of an anti-Christian power. And that's how Satan works. He will use a power as long as it's effective. When it starts to lose its effectiveness, he will bring up another power. And it's interesting that it says that when Napoleon's general Berthier went down to Rome and took the Pope captive and declared a republic, basically killed the beast, it says there wasn't one power in Europe that raised a finger to help it. The power and influence of the papacy was waning. So here was a new demonic power Satan was reigning up, an atheistic power. So instead, in the past, you had Catholicism was the state religion of Europe. Now Satan was trying, let's have atheism as the state religion. So Satan is a powerful foe. He's a cunning foe, and he will use any and all means to fight against the truth, even if it means hurting the first beast that he was using. He was using the papacy for a long time. He had finished with that, so he used this new beast, and it started by wounding the papacy beast, So Satan doesn't have any loyalty to the powers that he's used or people that he's used.
Right. But we will see also during this presentation that the beast of Revelation 13 and 17, it's actually interconnected to the beast of Revelation 11. And this is an aspect which many Christians, many Bible-believing Christians find very hard to understand. And as an example, I have a recent writer. He passed away a couple of years ago. A lot of people, if you're a Seventh-day Adventist, you probably remember Professor Desmond Ford, that has claimed that the two witnesses of Revelation 11 represent the church, when in the future it will prophesy in the sackcloth. And he's actually referring to this quotation from the book The Great Controversy by Ellen G. White and Testimonies to the Church. But on checking the source of these statements, we actually find that the quoted author, when elsewhere explaining the two witnesses of Revelation 11, clearly states that they represent the scriptures of the Old and New Testament. During the great part of this period, God's witnesses remain in a state of obscurity, as you mentioned before, Ross. Now, there is a later day significance of the prophecy. So we are not refuting let's say, the later day or the end time application of this prophecy, and this is what we're talking about. But the starting point, the anchoring point, was the French Revolution that succeeded the papacy. And now we're going to cover some of the topics of this later day significance of the prophecy. But before discussing a possible later day parallel for the fulfillment of the prophecy in Revelation 11, we should emphasize that this prophecy fits only one specific historical situation. A definite time period is involved of 42 prophetic months, and this can logically have only one legitimate fulfillment in history. Also, the beast of Revelation 11 is a specific political kingdom that arose at a specific time. Again, a lot of symbolic from the Bible. what is a kingdom in the Bible. The two witnesses you have already explained. We should always remember that the Bible is its own expositor. We always find the explanation of these symbols in the Bible. So from here, from our side, there will be no attempt, we will make no attempt to reapply this historical application, but we will like to reinstate a very also important principle of interpretation, which is we were not going to take a single phrase or a single event in the history from any publication or text, whatever event, and use it out of context in contradiction to other statements, maybe by the same author, in order to give the Revelation 11 or other verses a future application. This is not a method that can be sustained, a method of biblical interpretation. I just wanted to make that clear, that this is not going to happen from our side, which means that we're not going to take time events out of context and we're going to twist them, to specifically apply them to this application. Do you have any comment on this, Rod?
That's a very good point. No, I appreciate that, because we want to take the scriptures for what they mean. Now, God uses things as a type. There's a verse in the New Testament that talking about the people of Israel coming out of Egypt. He says all these things happened unto them for ensamples for us. So we can read the story of the Israelites and learn lessons from their experience. And I believe that's the case here. Revelation 11 is talking about the French Revolution, but we can study it and see some parallels. But that prophecy is specifically the French Revolution. But God has put it there because of the application it will have. And in other words, the similarities. It's going to be a global event at the end.
So as I was actually having some other presentation the previous weeks that was about an application of Daniel 12, and there is also similarity that it's very important about the Jerusalem, the prophecy about the fall of Jerusalem in year 70 AD, as it is with the French Revolution to the end time event. So why would you say, Ross, based on your many years experience as a religious person, as a Bible-believing Christian, why would God place this very specific prophecy about the French Revolution in the Bible? Because there has been many revolutions, along the history. And why with this specific revolution that happened in France, why would God place it in the Bible if it wasn't essential and important for us?
That's a good point. There's been, as you say, many revolutions. So why is God focused on this one? Because I believe, of course, this has got so many parallels with what's coming up. We have an amazing statement in the Spirit of Prophecy that talks about the conditions, the social conditions, the religious conditions, the way the people were being oppressed, which led to the revolution. That's the parallels. That's the close parallels we see. And I believe we have a quote coming up in your slides, where it brings out what was happening. You had this elite class, should we call them, at the top, that were basically living off the poor people. There we go. Yes, you've got it right there. This is such a significant statement. And it shows why God spelled out in chapter 11 of Revelation, the French Revolution, because it's the same conditions that is going to leave, and it's going to lead the whole world into a similar situation. Shall we read this statement? It's such a significant one.
Yes, please go ahead.
I'll read this if you like. This is from the book Education, page 228. It says, the centralizing of wealth and power, the vast combinations for the enriching of the few at the expense of the many, the combinations of the poorer classes for the defense of their interests and claims, the spirit of unrest, of riot and bloodshed, the worldwide dissemination of the same teachings that led to the French Revolution, all are tending to involve the whole world in a struggle similar to that which convulsed France. So that
Right.
spells out the key factors that led to the French Revolution, and that's significant because we see these exact factors at work in the world today. And human nature being what it is, human nature hasn't changed. It's going to lead to the same reaction. And I believe that's why God had this prophecy in Revelation 11 to warn us of what is coming.
So it's not just the political status of the French Revolution we should look at today. It's actually more than that. It's the social status, it's the economic
Yes.
status, and even more important, it's actually the mindset of the French people that we will find similar in our day and age.
Exactly. You've hit the nail on the head, exactly.
Well, let's go ahead, because in considering this remarkable prediction of the French Revolution and the ending of papal supremacy, in what sense then could there be a significance for us today? Well, we just read this quote from this inspired writer that actually was written in 1903. We are more than over 100 years ahead of 1903. So let's go ahead and see if this experience can have any significance for us today. And should we be looking at the signs around us, and why we should be looking at the signs around us. So let's go ahead and start with this by going through these 12 parallels that can be observed between the situation that involves revolutionary France and what is in process of being fulfilled in our world today. All right? So let's go with the first one here. Prior to the revolution, this is the first parallel. Prior to the revolution, France was called to receive gospel of Christ via the Protestant Reformation. Can you emphasize just a little bit on this, Ross? That was also a little part of your previous presentation.
Yes, because it was a policy of Rome, Church of Rome, to keep the scriptures away from the people, because I guess for the Church of Rome, the Bible caused them a lot of problems because people would see how far the church had fallen away. Paul wrote about the falling away in his day. And so the Roman Church had, part of its policy was the general population should not have the Bible. But the Reformation, if you like, discovered the Bible. You know, Martin Luther found that Bible in a monastery chained to a wall, and he discovered the verses, the just shall live by faith. And that was revolutionary. And as he began to share and teach what he was finding in the scriptures, it helped fuel the Protestant Reformation. And that was bringing the true gospel back to Europe, to Germany, to the Netherlands, to Britain, Scandinavia. And when it tried to come into France, that was the problem. The king worked with the papists, if you want to call them that, and they stamped it out. And so France had the opportunity to hear the true gospel, as other nations in Europe were, but it was snuffed out at the very beginning. So France remained in darkness. It remained in the dark ages, literally. It remained in the dark ages while other nations were coming into the light. And that set the stage. It set the conditions that made the French Revolution absolutely ripe for coming forth.
So rejecting the Protestant Reformation, in a sense, France actually brought itself into this position where they felt the consequences compared to other countries that accepted more or less fully the Protestant Reformation. Is that a correct assumption, would you say?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I've read, and it makes sense to me, that You know, Britain, England would have had a similar revolution, except that the Reformation had a better grounding there. And you had in the 1700s, leading up to the French Revolution, in England, you had the Wesleys preaching revival, preaching the Protestant message as they understood it at the time. And I've heard it said if it wasn't for the Wesley brothers preaching, probably Britain would have had a revolution as well. But it was that the preaching of the gospel which just kept the revolution at bay, whereas in France, of course, there was no similar preaching, and it just erupted into the French Revolution.
Right. Well, let's look at the connection that we have to what the world looks like today. Our world is being called to receive the gospel in the proclamation of the three angels' message of Revelation 14, which will culminate in the loud cry of Revelation 18, verse 1 to 4. This is a very important, not just similarity, but also a call. And it's not just a call, not just a simple call, but I would call it a very important wake-up call for us. Wouldn't you say so? For the world. And this is not just for us Bible-believing Christians.
Absolutely. God wants his word spread. The three angels' messages is saying, worship God and give glory to him. It's a very clear message to come back to the true worship of the Bible. And God is giving the world an opportunity, but as we know from prophecy, sadly, as usually happens when God tries to bring a message, the people will largely reject it. You know, it's very sad.
So if we compare to the French Revolution, we will experience a world as such that will more or less entirely reject this wake-up call, the gospel of the three angels' messages. Is that the correct assumption, would you say?
Well, maybe not entirely reject, because obviously the gospel is going to reach many people, and there will be many martyrs, we're told, in the last days. So people will make a stand. It won't be the majority. The majority of the world is going to reject this. They will go along with the official view, shall we say, the mainstream media position, you know. But there will be people that will wake up, they'll hear, and they'll accept it. It's a bit like when the Protestant Reformation started in Germany. It was a small movement that grew, and it was opposed by the state church, the government, but it had a core group that kept it going. And I think we'll find the same today. When God works to give the three angels messages, it'll be a small minority, but there'll be a dedicated group that will accept it. God knows who it is. You know, I was just sharing, interesting, I don't know if you've seen this, but there are Muslims having dreams. I don't know if you've heard this. I got a friend of mine in the UK was sharing how God is giving dreams to Muslims, and it's about the three angels' messages. In the dream, they see in the sky three angels flying, and they hear the first angels speaking, and it's the first part of the three angels' messages found in Revelation 14. And then the message given to them is find the people that are teaching this message. So obviously God can reach honest-hearted people wherever they are, even if they're in a situation where they don't have free access to the Bible or good teaching. God can reach them through dreams. And it's a call to listen, to find out about these three angels' messages. So God is going to have the message go, even if his church has not done a good job and failed in many respects. God is going to make sure that message will go to the whole world. And we're called, you and I. So we're called to share this message. Carry on.
Yes, very important point to make in relation to the first parallel that we find, because this is not a statement that we make out of blue just because it's our own opinion. This is actually a statement from the Bible that we find in Revelation 13, chapter 13, verse 3, 8, 11 to 17, that the majority will reject the gospel of the three angels' message and instead worship the beast and his image. However, as you mentioned, there will be people that will take a stand. So is this already visible? Okay. Well, let's look at the next parallel that we have to cover here. This is number 3. The populace, the masses, was led to believe that Rome alone could dispense salvation and that Protestantism would destroy the peace of nation. And I want to just make a clear, not just a clear statement, but to emphasize that this is the mindset that was induced over the masses at that point in time through the mass media at that time. Well, they didn't have internet at that point, so the Catholic clergy was, as such, we would say the majority. Well, they have the mainstream majority at that point in time. So, is it a correct assumption, would you say, from your understanding of the world now, since you're on the other side of the world, down under, maybe you see things a little bit different than up here in Scandinavia, in Denmark, where we are located. But would you say that that was the mindset during the French Revolution, that the masses were led to believe that Rome alone was the way to salvation, and Protestantism would destroy the peace of the nation? So what we see here, I'd like to add, is that Protestantism was demonized. Reformation was demonized. Everyone adhering to the Protestant Reformation was seen as more or less the enemy of the state, the enemy of society, a group of people that should be shunned from society. People should be afraid of them, and as we know from history, many of them were killed.
Yes, exactly. The Reformation was seen as a big threat, a danger, a problem to society, a pest. This is like a cancer that needs to be uprooted. Of course, what we're going to see in our day, now that Protestantism is so compromised and Catholics and Protestant denominations are signing agreements and understanding, so they're coming back together. The enemy is going to be this little group preaching the three angels' messages now. So as the reformers were treated by the church and the government of its day, the people preaching the three angels' messages are going to be treated that way in our day.
Right. Do we already see this mindset being manufactured for the masses today, if we want to compare to what's happening today? Because I believe, as I'm making the statements here on the presentation, that similar arguments will be used today during the end time to secure the union of all society under Rome. The masses will also be deceived by great signs and wonders, as Jesus made a clear statement in Matthew 24, until all the world wanders after the beast. So, Ross, do we see not just small steps, not just a hint there and there because we want to make some twisted opinions, fitting into this prophetic end time big picture, but do we see real situations happening today where the mindset of the masses are being manufactured, are being brainwashed to actually think in a similar manner as the masses were doing during the French Revolution?
Absolutely, totally. I don't think we've yet seen the full ripeness, if you like, want to call it that, or the end result where it's going to end up. But we're seeing all the trends are heading that way. You'll find on the mainstream media that Catholicism is promoted as Christianity. There's no distinction anymore. Protestants, Catholics, all working together. The Reformation principle, which said, we've come out of that religion, is gone. I don't think we're yet seeing the full accomplishment of this when the whole world wonders. We haven't seen we see miracle working power already, but not on a huge scale to the point where everybody's galvanized to wonder after the beast. It's going to become one day, if you criticize the Pope, as you're going to be almost like an anti-revolutionary, an enemy of the country, enemy of the state. I think it will get to that point
Well,
where there'll be so much pressure.
there is
Yes,
already
go on.
just to mention this. Sorry to interrupt. In United States, there is a
That's right.
bill to criminalize everyone which is not just criticizing, but is called an anti-government narrative. So one senator in United States Congress actually proposed a bill to criminalize criticizing Dr. Anthony Fauci, which probably a lot of people, a lot of us knows who he is. So the mindset, it's already there. We are seeing regulation and legislation tried to being put in place. We already see that the mainstream media are demonizing everyone and everybody which goes against the mainstream narrative. So I would say we have pretty much a lot of similar arguments today that we will see today. But this is us talking. We can make a lot of assumptions. People would say, let's see what is actually happening in the world today. So let's have a look, because do we find information, plausible, credible information in the world today? Well, as many of us know, those of us that are actually studying the time events, seeing what's happening around us, we know that in the year 2015, Pope Francis wrote his controversial encyclical called Laudato Si, where he commands the nations, and actually this is the tone, he commands the nation to confess their collective sins of exploiting the environment with capitalism. And he says, "Praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister, Mother Earth, to sustain us." And I just want to make a short note here, Ross. Maybe you would like to comment on this. Is this biblical? Is this Christian, Bible-believing Christianity, to place Mother Earth into a sister position, who sustain us on the kind of the same level as Jesus? This is how I read. This is just the first statement. What is your take on this?
It's very clever, isn't it? I mean, obviously, as Christians, we believe in being good stewards, and God gave man dominion of this earth, so we should be good stewards of it. But this is being used for political reasons. Protecting the environment is a good thing, but this is being used as a leverage, because it's going to be used ultimately, I believe, to push for an environmental Sabbath, one day of the week. Even during the lockdown, they were saying, hey, the environment was benefited by the lockdown, so maybe we should have this one day a week lockdown for everybody, a family day where people can get together with their families and look after the environment. It's being used as a political tool to push for an institution that Rome invented, which is Sunday sacredness. It's very clever, isn't it?
Well, many people can see it, and we'll see if actually the same data that we get from the Vatican, from the papacy, and even though the mainstream media, because mainstream media, they do in purpose sometimes actually proclaim the truth. But let's see what the papacy, Pope Francis, has to say. He's saying that Mother Earth is actually sustaining us. The sister now cries out to us because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords, as masters entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness, evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all form of life. Now, I'm not going to have a conversation about Laudato Si here. There is a lot of information here that could be discussed, a lot of similarities. We should compare this to Bible. We have done it in other programs. A lot of other good Bible-believing Christians have done this. What I'm trying to actually set the record straight here. And I'm going to try to build up the picture and the image that we see in our day and age, in our own very generation today, that what is happening today. So Laudato Si back in 2015, which was released a couple of months before Pope Francis actually presented this Laudato Si to United Nations in New York. Let's see what is going on 6 years later. This letter, this encyclical, had this letter any impact on us today? Well, it did, because it seems that it appears that Pope Francis' letter agenda is succeeding. The nations are listening. So according to this Pew Research Center, global concern over the dubious science of climate change has exploded. 13 out of the 26 countries surveyed considered climate change to be their number one national threat. And I'm talking here about number one national threat. So it's not about terrorism anymore. It's not about any pandemic, but a lot of countries and a lot of people seriously believe that the climate change is actually the number one national threat. I don't know about New Zealand, Ross. Maybe you could enlighten us about how people of New Zealand, how the, let's say, the official narrative wraps around this climate change scenario.
Yes, it's a political hot potato here, if you like, too. It's being used. I do know a lot of farmers are suffering heavily because they feel like they call themselves, we're not the punching bag, we're not the the scapegoat for all the woes of the world. And yet they're feeling that way. The government here seems very opposed to farmers, So it's being used very much as a political football here. And yet the evidence is, I believe, and also, I'll tell you what, we know from Great Controversy, the book Great Controversy, that as we find in the story of Job, when Satan has power, he can cause climate problems, In the story of Job, Satan sent a whirlwind to destroy the house where Job's children were. And we read in the book Great Controversy that disasters which Satan can cause are going to increase more and more. And of course, it's going to be blamed on climate change. And so what Satan himself creates is going to be used as a political tool to take away people's liberties. That's why we're blessed to have these inspired insights in the book Great Controversy and in the Bible to understand what's really going on in these situations.
Right.
There's also evidence that the globe does go through cycles anyway of heat and cold. There's been warm events during the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages. There was some record highs back in the 1930s, So it appears that there are hot and cold cycles that occur naturally anyway. And it could be that we're going into a warm phase at the moment. And this is being blamed on global warming, climate change. We need to oppose those who are destroying the environment. Now, I'm not endorsing big companies that do damage the environment. We know that's not good. But I think, again, this is being politicized to take away our liberties. That's what's really happening here.
Right. Well, it looks like the United States has also been deceived, because according to the same Pew Research, nearly 6 in 10 Americans today sees climate change as a major threat to their nation, whereas over 5 years before, only 4 in 10 Americans saw the climate change as a threat. This is what this research is actually showing. So, by riding a wave of fear, Pope Francis has kind of hypnotized many to take action in a similar way that we see around the world a majority of people which is being kind of hypnotized about what is happening today, and we do not see any, more or less, any reaction by just following everything the official narrative is stating. Well, their governments are more willing, not willing to submit even at the detriment of their own population. In his most recent encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, Francis applauds his living predecessor, Benedict XVI, where we read, and I took a screenshot of the paragraph 173, where he states, I know that the text is very small here, but he says that in this regard, I would also note the need for reform of the United Nations organization and likewise of economic institution and international finance so that the concept of the family of nation can acquire real teeth. How does it play in your Bible believing end time prophetic mindset, Ross, this statement?
Very interesting. He's talking about giving these organizations real teeth because they were set up obviously as a dialogue, as an advisory organization. But he's saying real teeth. What does that mean? We know in Revelation 13 it talks about the image to the beast is going to be set up, and obviously the image of the beast is going to be an oppressive power, just as the beast was. The image of the beast is like the beast. It's why it's called an image of it. And so this is playing right into the hands of having an oppressive organizational system or whatever it is that's going to look just like the beast was during the Dark Ages. And so it's ironic that here's the papacy talking about giving teeth to this organization. And it's interesting, in Revelation 13, the papacy is pictured as the beast, but in Revelation 17, it's a woman sitting on a beast, the woman being the church, riding the beast. So, and that's how the papacy works. It will use other organizations to accomplish its end. That's what it did in Europe in the Dark Ages. It used the state to punish heresy. The church used the state, and that's what we're seeing right there. As that quote you just pointed out, they want to give teeth to this organization to carry out the will of the papacy.
So do we see actually a biblical fulfillment? I know there is a little bit of delay in the sound here, so I'm sorry if I do interrupt you. But do we see an exact biblical fulfillment, as you have pointed out, that in Revelation 17, the same beast of Revelation 13 is going to use international organizations that has worldwide powers as we see today, United Nations, and we're going to mention in a few seconds the World Economic Forum, because the papacy is also allied with, of course, the World Economic Forum. So is that a far-reaching, statement to say that when we look at today's world and we actually point to the exact event, this is a statement, this is a screenshot which I recently took from the World Economic website. You can find a link below. The Vatican has urged Catholics to drop investments in fossil fuels and arms. This is straight from the World Economic website, World Economic Forum, the elite club of globalist elites in businesses and government. This is what the World Economic Forum is. There is, should be, at least in our minds, no doubt that these people, I don't believe they have our interests. This is on the surface. It sounds so nice. It sounds like they're doing their best. They're putting their time, resources, and money at stake, to make the world a better living place. This is what probably a lot of people believe. But this is not what the Bible is telling us. We see the connection to the beast of Revelation 17 here. The Bible has already prophesied that this is what's going to happen. We see already the signs. We see that in exchange for his parroting of their world agenda, the WEF, the World Economic Forum, adores Francis with Catholic panels at the annual Davos gathering, as well as touting his decrees on their website. And this is again another screenshot from the website, an article stating that here is the Pope's prescription for resetting the global economy in response to COVID-19. So Ross, now you tell me from down under, how do you see this if you take your Bible prophecy glasses? Do we see here a fulfillment of Revelation 17?
Absolutely. You can see the trends, can't we? Because we know from prophecy that there's going to be an economic boycott on those who don't receive the mark of the beast. They won't be able to buy or sell. In other words, there's going to be some restrictions on the economic activity of those who don't go along with the image of the beast and the mark of the beast. And of course, you come to Revelation 18 and you read about the rich men that are weeping because of what happens to Rome right at the end. So Rome has always been very much tied up with the moneyed organization, the kings of nations, or where the wealth is. So absolutely, this falls right into the pattern that we've always seen with the Roman Catholic Church. They love to have their hands in where the money is going. And having a global economic reset is a perfect pretext for bringing in more and more control. So they don't like free enterprise. They want to have moneyed control. So this is absolutely setting it up, setting the mindset, preparing people's minds for basically an economic takeover of the money systems of the world. It's amazing.
Right. Well, this is a front page article on the World Economic Forum's website. This is not just an obscure article that somebody has been writing as they would do for any other of their members. So actually, the World Economic Forum lauds Francis for his affirmation of their principles and denunciation of what they call, this is their derogatory name for capitalism and democracy, they call it neoliberalism, which, by the way, democracy has been brought and blessed by the Protestant Reformation and not by the French Revolution, as many people believe today. This has been an induced belief in the society today. What the French Revolution has brought to us is atheism, rejecting God, killing the two witnesses, by the way, and this is what the society is building, at least in the Western society, is building, yes, on the false presumption that the French Revolution has brought us freedom, equality, and democracy. This is a totally false narrative and statement if you really love and like real history. So let's go back to our presentation, because what we see today in the world, this is exactly what's happening. We have the major players of this world, Al Gore, John Kerry, others, have radical plans for a great reset of capitalism. So we see Ross here, we see the interconnection between the papacy, the beast of Revelation 17, and the kings of this world. Any comments on this?
Yeah, I was interested to read that last headline you had, because it talks about the great reset in the Western world. This is the irony. Yeah, there it is. It says, socialist outline is clear: destroy the global capitalist economy and reform the Western world. You see, the Western world came about, the United States was set up, the most powerful nation in the Western world, on the principle of freedom, civil liberty, and religious liberty. And as a result, that nation was blessed economically. It had economic liberty as well. You know what I'm saying? Free enterprise. You get the opposite extreme socialist countries like communism, where everything is controlled. The government controls everything, wages, etc. And I can tell you which systems I'm happier to live in. I'd rather live in a free enterprise economy than a communist economy. But you'll see the voice coming out of the Vatican is very much pro-socialism, because the Vatican loves control. It's what it had all during the Dark Ages. It was in bed with the state and it would breathe down people's necks. They manipulated, they managed everybody's day-to-day lives. And the United States was a reaction to that. They said, no, we're not going to have any religious laws. Everyone's free to choose what they want. We're going to have civil liberty. They threw off the yoke, if you like, of this church-state thing that had controlled Europe for so long. And yet people today forget their history. They're moving back towards this socialist model because they think it's better. The capitalist model has been demonized. And sure, there are people that do get super rich at the top, but generally everybody's better off because you have a large middle class. But you go back to communism, they'll destroy the middle class, and you'll end up with the Dark Ages again, where you get a super elite and everyone else is ground down into poverty. That's where Rome would love to have things again, and that's where Rome is pushing this, and people can't see it happening that way. They're not only against religious liberty, they're against economic liberty as well. This is the scary thing.
Right. Well, and now we have the WEF, World Economic Forum, along with IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the United Nations, pushing this radical global agenda in cooperation with the Vatican, which we have mentioned several times, the Great Reset. There is also a video that features on the World Economic Forum website. I don't have it here with me today. We don't have time to cover the amount of information and the data which is actually available out there if one cares to search for it. Do we find anything today in the world today? And again, this is not some obscure website which some people will deemed to be some conspiracy theory somewhere in a corner. We're taking information right, from the beast, the belly of the beast, the World Economic Forum, the Vatican website, some of the mainstream medias. But in this video, I was just mentioning, we have the global so-called heavy hitters, including Klaus Schwab, founder of the World Economic Forum, Prince Charles, vehement so-called green advocate, Kristalina Georgieva, which is at this time the head of the International Monetary Fund, and Ajay Banga, I believe is his name, he's the CEO of MasterCard. Each and single one of them advocates for the acceleration of the global reset because they want to achieve what they believe is essential for humanity, the fourth industrial revolution. And now they build on the pandemic. Their agenda includes also an aggressive environmental component, which is the climate change scenario, which I believe is going to replace the pandemic narrative which we have in the media and in the world today. I believe by the fall, it has already started, is going to replace the pandemic narrative. We're going to have more and more about this climate change, and we're going to most likely see the mindset of lockdowns being implemented also into the climate change narrative. However, I'm not a prophet. I'm just reading the science. This climate change narrative is bent on net zero emission, as we know, which is also a major part of the Agenda 2030 and other changes to global governance, such as worldwide control of movement. And by the way, I have this screenshot of a video which you can find on World Economic Forum website. Common Pass is a framework to link health, COVID, test, and travel. And a lot of people, I believe, has been deceived, Ross. to believe that this is something to do with health. Now, we're not going to go into the conversation about the COVID here. That's part of other studies. There are many videos, thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of videos. Our goal here in this program is to link it to the French Revolution and the prophetic mindset that God wants us to have. So if you, by just looking at this, common pass, health, test, travel, I believe it's on purpose. They have placed it with different colors. So common pass has to do with your health and your travel. What does it tell us? Do we see some prophetic linkage to what is happening today and to what these international organizations have in mind for us today?
Well, during the Dark Ages, it was very hard to go outside the norm. Some of the reformers that popped up had a real battle on their hands because society was so controlled, so watched, shall we say, surveilled. That's why when they set up America, they talked about not having unreasonable searches. People should be safe in their papers, in their homes, because they were used to the Dark Ages where you had the oppressive state breathing down your neck. You couldn't speak out against it. And I'm sure the powers that be that want to bring the world back to that are working hard. And so travel restrictions, you can see that falling right into that. Social media monitors what happens, what people say. You can imagine when they have a cashless society, if they have an economic reset, they bring in a new money system, maybe a cashless society. That means every transaction you make has to be done through a third party. Once upon a time, if you went to a shop with cash, the transaction is between you and the shopkeeper. If you use an electronic means of carrying out the transaction, there's a third party, the bank. And that's not only monitoring, but they can control. They might just determine that if you haven't got your COVID passport, you can't buy and sell. You know what I'm saying? This is where things could go. The infrastructure's in place, and now the mindset is being prepared in the population to accept these things. We live in very, very troubling times, knowing where the world has come from. Oh, are you there, Michael? We can't hear you anymore.
Sure, I just forgot to unmute my microphone. I'm saying that, by the way, if anyone is interested to read Klaus Schwab, The Fourth Industrial Revolution book, it's available freely on this website, which you can find, where he's actually arguing for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Why do we need a great reset? And this is not just an idea from a single person, by the way. This is an agenda, this is a plan, which, as we speak, Ross, is being fully implemented worldwide. As I understand, New Zealand, it's again in a full lockdown because of 30 flu cases, I believe, you mentioned.
Yes. New Zealand is currently in full lockdown, yes.
And as we know, around the world, this has been destroying the economies and having all these social and psychological impacts, tremendous consequences. So the plan is, as they state, is to make this wealth redistribution, including universal basic wage, universal basic income. And if this is something new you haven't heard before, comment to our viewers, in Easter message, Pope Francis proposes universal basic income. Well, the growth of secular government at the expense of personal freedom also highlight the Great Reset. The COVID crisis, this is a statement coming from the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab is making this statement, has shown that our world systems are not fit anymore for the 21st century. It has laid bare the fundamental lack of social cohesion, fairness, inclusion, and equality. And let me just pause here, Ross, because what we see in this statement from Klaus Schwab, it's actually, we see that some similarities, inclusion, equality, and how does this relate to the French Revolution?
Yeah, it's interesting because what came out of the French Revolution was this cry for, was it liberty, equality, a lot of buzzwords, shall we say.
Yeah.
And a lot of these revolutions are very good at having buzzwords or catchphrases or, slogans, which, if you like, is a form of propaganda. So people think, yes, you must be for the revolution. If you're anti the revolution, then you're anti-liberty, you're anti-equality, And that's how the powers that are running the revolution would love it be, because they want anyone who opposes the revolution to be oppressed or put down or stopped. So if you connect the revolution with lots of good buzzwords or slogans, how could you dare go against that, It's very clever propaganda, and we see the same thing. It's happened before in communist revolutions. It's happened other times. We need to be very careful of following buzzwords and slogans, and not looking at what things are really, really standing for behind the scenes.
Right. Well, Ross, would you believe that this club of elite people, the globalists, which gather in Davos every year, a couple of times per year, as I believe, not just one time, that's the official statements, do you believe that their agenda is actually for the good of humanity? Because this is what we see today. The majority of people, they just go ahead with their life. They don't even stop to think about what's going on, what kind of decisions are being taken. Nevertheless, the prophetic time frame, the prophetic picture, which is being placed just before our eyes, is telling us very clear that all these statements, they're actually interconnected, and nevertheless interconnected to Revelation 13, 17, the beast that we find explained there, as we have seen so far. So WEF, the World Economic Forum, 60 use COVID to accelerate and enforce the Great Reset. As we know, Klaus Schwab, founder of this forum, made this statement that we find here on the screen. Now, if this league, put it back on the screen here. Yes, here it comes. Well, if this League of Vatican, United Nations, and World Economic Forum were to succeed, the Great Reset would push global societal inclusion and justice, as they call it, as they explain it, as they envision it, at the expense of national sovereignty, individual rights, and the suppression of true Christianity. This is a bold statement that I'm doing here. So it's either the Great Reset or else. This is how would you explain this, Ross?
Yeah, of course, there's people that want to change our world, and they're not going to be open in what their goals are. That's the world we live in. We live in a world that deals in propaganda, and as Christians, we've got to rise above that. We must realize that all these movements wanting to change the world, we know that this world is ultimately doomed. We need to give the gospel message to say, hey, politicians don't have the answers. These big church organizations don't have the answers. The real answers in the three angels' messages and getting ready. All of this is the backdrop. Satan getting things in place. Satan is ultimately, his goal is to get rid of all the true followers of Jesus off this earth. He would love to be able to get to the point where he can say there's not a single person on earth that's keeping God's law. That's what he would like to achieve. And all this that we're seeing is Satan's efforts to bring that about, the backdrop.
Right.
He wants to get a situation where he can oppress and make it very as difficult as he can for people to follow God. That's really what his goal is. But of course, it's all dressed up under, good social reforms that are needed, or economic reform, whatever it's called. But we know Satan's working through people behind the scenes who have their own very selfish motives, but it's dressed up to look nice.
Well,
And Satan's got his agenda.
by the way, this is not just it's in plain sight. If one cares, as I said before, if one cares to do your homework, and this is not just for you and I, but also for our viewers, this is happening today. Actually, this is the last statement I'm going to put in today's presentation. We have here a statement which is taken straight out of this official document, which is part of the United Nations, the International Forum for Social Development. This is the social justice document, agenda. In an open world, this is being rolled and implemented out all over the world. And this is the statement. I just took a screenshot. I believe it's page number 2, where the statement says, the present-day believers in an absolute truth identify with virtue and justice are neither willing nor desirable companions for the defenders of social justice, right? So here you have it, my friend. If you want to stand for absolute truth, if you identify yourself with virtue and justice as it is being presented by the Bible, by the Protestant Reformation, you are not welcome. This is, they say, you are not welcome in the fourth industrial revolution, where the social justice, so-called social justice agenda is going to be one of the basics in the new society they want to create. So do you have a closing statement, or based on what we've just read here, Ross, and for just to wrap up this first presentation in this topic?
Yes, I think it's clear. We can see that the trends in the world that are leading to the same conditions that the French Revolution erupted out of, because we know from inspiration that the whole world is going to be convulsed in a similar way to France was. And so the social conditions are being met. You have these huge organizations, you have giant monopolies in the economic world, you have gigantic monopolies in the social world, shall we say. We're talking about the United Nations and all the organizations and branches they have, trying to manipulate society to what they want. And it is just creating the environment for the world to be, well, a repeat of the French Revolution. And what Satan wants to accomplish out of all that, of course, is to, in the chaos, get rid of God's people. But, the good news is, of course, to summarize, is God is going to have a message that's going to go to the world. He will have a people waiting for him at his second coming. And he can say, here are they that keep the commandments of God and have the faith of Jesus. It's going to be a scary ride, shall we say, but God is going to do some amazing things in this time, when you've got the world so controlled by evil, and yet God's going to be pouring out his Spirit, and there's going to be such a contrast between the powers of evil and the powers of good, that people will see clearly what the issue is. And a lot of people are going to accept the three angels' messages. Sadly, we know the majority are going to wonder after the beast, the miracles that are going to happen. It's going to look good. It's going to sound good. But God is going to make it clear that here are his people. And so people are going to make a choice. So all these things that we see happening in the world I mean, I can imagine if you're living in France back in the days of the French Revolution, you'd go, wow, this is scary. What's going to happen? But you see, God can look after his people. Remember, the three worthies are thrown in the fiery furnace. God was right there with them. So while these, as you say, these are scary events, Michael, we know that God can protect his people if we put ourselves on his side. I'm sure you know that.
Amen to that, Ross. And thank you for being part of this first program. And thank you to our viewers. This is a lot of information we have to cover. We still have 9 parallels to go, comparing the French Revolution to what is happening today in the world and the end time events. As I said in the beginning, most likely for many of our viewers, this is maybe something new. Maybe you haven't thought before that the French Revolution would have an impact on our society, or even on the end time events which are happening, have started to happen in the world today. So please stay tuned with us. We're going to announce on our website and our YouTube channel when the next program with Ross Patterson from New Zealand is going to be. And feel free to also just to have a look at the Ross Patterson's website, which is dig.com, Unearthing Noah's Ark. Ross has a huge project going on, unfortunately restrained by the situation worldwide today. So again, thank you, Ross, and hopefully I'll see you next time. And yes, take care.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. And yes, we've got some more interesting things to look at next time.
Right.